Hi, my name is Tanya. I'm a disability rights activist and I'm autistic. This is the first in a series of videos that I'm making to address the questions around curing autism, recovering children from autism, treating autism. Is it realistic to try? Is it sensible to try to do this? Now, where am I coming from? I've spent many years studying autism. I've spent many years studying the perspectives of autistic people. I've spent many years reading medical literature around autism, applying some of that to my own life. I've passed that on to friends. I've collaborated with parents of autistic children, particularly those with high support needs. Many of my fellow activists have high support needs and do not speak. And I've worked with autism organizations, with doctors, with allied health professionals. To address this question, or these questions, is it worth trying to cure autism or treat or recover someone from autism? The questions themselves are framed in what some disability rights activists call the pathology paradigm. In other words, they're framed in such a way that you already assumed that autism is some kind of an illness or a disorder. And so therefore, because you wouldn't be trying to treat or cure or recover somebody from something which is not wrong, right? But I'm going to go along with that for a while, even though it's not an accurate reflection of my own perspective, but we need to go there. I feel that we need to go there because there are many autistic people who will just argue and say, no, we shouldn't do this. And you don't want to take the argument all the way through. So let's start. And to begin, we can't solve a problem if we don't understand a problem. And that partially means that we need to talk about words and their meanings, because if we're going to be using them in our argument and we're going to be arguing around those words, we do need to have some consensus on what those words actually mean. So in this video, I'm going to focus first of all just on what autism actually is. And that's not really an easy answer. You can Google it and you'll get many definitions. But I think it's important to see how all those definitions came about, how people came to their conclusions. One thing we do know is the people nowadays described by the word autism, there have been people like this around for a long time. There have been people who, had they lived today, would have met the diagnostic criteria for autism, but they lived a long time ago. So this is not a new thing, whatever autism may be. And for that, there are researchers, for example, Steve Silberman researched the history of autistic people. It was one of a number of people who've looked at autism from a historical perspective. Okay, so we've been around for a while. But what is autism? Well, we weren't always collectively put into the same basket. People who today would be called autistic. We may have gone by different names and we wouldn't have been seen as being part of the same thing. What happened though in the 20th century was that various psychologists and other people started noticing patterns between people and then moved from what they called childhood schizophrenia to eventually something called autism, and decided that there was a thing called a spectrum. In other words, a collection of different people who may be quite different but have certain overlapping traits, and therefore we all belong in this box. And they gave it a label, autism, based on the idea that auto means self, that we are all locked up in our own little worlds and not concerned with the outside world. This is a misnomer, it's a misunderstanding, because this is not the truth. It may become true at times, just as when anybody is ill and they're really not feeling okay. it's hard for them to focus on the big wide world out there and everybody else's needs. Well, they might be even overwhelmed by everybody else's needs, but to just be okay, they need to focus on their own body. So sometimes that happens to autistic people too, and it can lead to this misconception. And there are other reasons which I can get to in later videos. Be that as it may, in the early years, as people started seeing patterns between autistic people, some didn't speak, we had repetitive movements, we did things called stimming, which is what I'm doing with my hair right now, fiddling, fidgeting. These were some of the things that we typically do. They started seeing these patterns and they wondered why we were as we were. And they had their own hypotheses, in other words, their own ideas about it. And based on these ideas, they decided what should be done about us. Some of these ideas we now know are wrong. But this thing of what should be done about people like us led to methods and therapies and so on, which still exist today, which do not address our problems, but which are thrown at us in spite of not addressing our problems. And we can more clearly see that now that we've got a clearer idea of what autism actually is or is not. There was a time when autism was thought to be a kind of behavioral or psychological problem that some children got because of the way that their mothers treated them or acted towards them. Or there were even some theories about like the way that the mother felt when the child was still in the womb affected the child, or, you know, her psychological issues rubbed off on the child in some kind of a way. And that the way to recover children would be then to work through these psychological issues. And that was done by psychoanalysis. In France, this is a popular approach to autism. These things do not well, these methods do not well address what autism actually is and what we now know autism to be. There were behavioral therapies, things where they didn't necessarily feel that it was the mother's fault, but they felt that regardless of where the problem might come from, these autistic people behave in ways which don't really work in our society. So we've got to fix them, we've got to change them. And so behavioral therapies were prescribed, which still persist and have a big influence, especially in North America and the UK and certain other countries as well, on the lives of autistic people, because, you know, we seem to be behaving wrong. It still doesn't really address what autism is, and the people who do those therapies, who perform those things, don't get to learn what autism is normally as part of their training. If they are highly trained behavioral analysts, for example, it's not considered relevant to find out what autism is, what drives our behavior. They just want to change the behavior. So now we can take a look back at several years, many years in fact, of research to try to figure out, because some people were trying to find out, can they fix this from the inside? Can they learn biologically, for example, what autism is? Because maybe then they can cure it if they can find the genetic cause or the physiological cause or the something. Maybe they can do something about that and they can fix us. And they can change the way we are. Well, they found a few things. Among other things, they found that there doesn't seem to be one single reason or cause for why we turn out the way that we are. They found out that autism has hereditary components. In other words, we can inherit certain things from our parents that end up with us being like this. And I wanted to avoid the word genetic, but I'm going to go there for a moment as well. Sometimes there are genetic influences. Sometimes if you have certain variants of genes, certain gene mutations, it's pretty certain you're going to end up having the kind of traits which would lead to an autism diagnosis if you are with somebody who knows how to diagnose autism. But that's not the case for everybody. And so when these genetic patterns started emerging, this gene and that gene and these genes or those genes in combination, a high chance of somebody ending up with these traits, behavioral traits, then maybe we need to find all are the genes. And if we can find all the genes, then we can what? We can maybe stop people like this from being born, or maybe we can, now that you've got CRISPR around, maybe we can edit their genes, or maybe something like that. So that takes us to one potential path for if you want to treat or cure autism. We've looked at two other ones, the behavioral and the, psychological, trying to help you to deal with your issues that you had with your mother, which turned out is not actually correct. The behavioral one, which doesn't link to anything, it's just like, oh, if we can change your behavior, then it must be okay. Forget about how you might feel when you grow up or how that changes your life. No, if we can change your behavior now and before you get out of our program, then things are hunky-dory, which they aren't. So that leaves us then with thoughts around possibly the biological route. Now, I've talked so far about causes of autism, potential causes, which are not yet fully defined. If we know there's some genetic component, it's possible also that our environment also plays a role in us becoming autistic. Not so much like everybody shouted at you and then you became autistic, in other words, like how people treated you, but more it might have been to do with the way that we developed, our bodies developed in response to the environment that we were exposed to chemically, for example. And then to some extent, yes, if there's stresses around you, different inputs, people treat you in a certain way, those things can trigger biological processes, of course, as well. And so that's also an area that people might want to examine and have indeed taken a look at too. So now that we have a bit more research, we can say a bit better what autism could be on the inside, but not quite. Because the funny thing is that even though looking at the genes, we found that they're not all the same in all autistic people. There's a whole plethora of genes, and even if you have this gene, it's not necessarily going to lead to you being autistic, having these traits. It could be some things to do with environment, something happened, triggered a certain process. These are all speculative reasons, but not everybody had that. So there's one thing we can pretty much say for sure. Even though examining autistic people's brains have by and large revealed that many of us have got certain types of lots of neurons in ways that non-autistic people don't have, for example. But there are so many of these physiological things which are just not in every person who fits these criteria for an autism diagnosis. So we're actually dealing with a bunch of different things which may have a lot of overlaps, but they're not all one thing. And this is the most important starting point for, is it worth curing autism? Should we even try? Is it possible to cure autism? Is it possible to recover somebody from autism? Because if somebody says, yes, it is, and here are the 3 simple steps, or this is the substance that you should take, or this is what you should do, and this is the treatment, you're not treating people who have the same thing. So this is bound to fail on some people if it works at all on anybody. That then is our departure point. Now, where am I going to end up with this, you might want to ask? And perhaps I should hint going forward what you're going to hear. You're not going to hear me suggesting that we try to cure all of autism. We now need to narrow down what autism really is in this whole big hodgepodge of all different people who fell into the same box, to see whether any kind of intervention could work, is actually needed, could make things worse. How do we determine which people need the treatment? Which ones are better left alone? Which ones are better given support? And I know some people are going to be watching this video and be feeling really annoyed at this stage, because they're going to say, oh yes, so you're saying that some people need to have their autism treated, and some people, oh yes, so now I'm already going to disagree with you, because they think that's where I'm going with this. We can't treat a thing. We shouldn't try to treat a thing if we haven't clearly defined what it is that we're trying to treat and why. So, without giving away what I'm going to be doing in a subsequent video, let me give you an analogy so that you go forward with this. There are some people in the world who are very tall. There are, in fact, some nations who are very tall. The Dinka in Africa are among the world's tallest people. I don't know whether the Maasai on average are taller than them. Some of us from other nations also end up quite tall. Maybe we had tall parents. Maybe the rest of the people are not so tall. So unless everybody's houses really have low ceilings and low lintels. In fact, when I was in the 1980s, I was in England, in a certain part of England, where there was a reconstructed village, which was supposed to be of Boudica, the British Queen, and the people who lived in that part of Norfolk many hundreds of years ago. And the houses had very, very low, the doors were so small. I mean, I'm not particularly tall, but we all had to kind of go like this to get in. So clearly, in that environment, if you were 6'4", for example, you would you would have been seen as some kind of a freak, maybe, and maybe it would have been seen as a good thing, because maybe you'd be seen as particularly strong, or maybe it would have been seen as a bad thing, because you don't fit in anywhere, literally. And there's no chairs, which are standard chairs, which work for you. There's no houses, everything, you're a giant. But is there something wrong with you? Well, it depends. In those days, people died younger. People ate different food. The average person didn't grow that tall in that environment. Is it bad to be tall now? Well, it also depends. It depends on whether you're healthy. Did you have too much growth hormone, which caused you to rapidly grow to the extent of causing pain, to the extent of causing your knees to struggle, so that now that you are finally 7'7" tall, you end up walking with crutches? Then maybe, since the medical world likes to frame things either as that you're either okay or you're not okay, or you're somewhere towards the not okay side, or you're okay enough, there's this kind of polar thing, then maybe because that causes struggles, and it would have caused struggles even if there were houses that were big enough, even if you had all these things adapted to you, maybe it would still have been kind of difficult for you. Maybe you would say, I don't wish this kind of knee problem on anybody else. So if there is a way to prevent this when you reach a certain age from growing this rapidly, then yeah, I'd kind of like to stop this thing. So is being tall wrong? Or is having too much growth hormone, which causes a bunch of other problems besides growing, wrong? That should give us a clue. that if we're going to treat something, maybe autism isn't the right word for what we should be treating, just like tallness is not the right word for what we should be treating. We should be looking at what the struggles are that somebody may have, that even with accommodations, in my example, changing the size of the doors and that kind of thing, even with that, somebody would still say, here is something that's not okay. Here is something that I would really want to have different if I could. Then what are those things? Because many autistic people do have things like that, and they are medical problems. But there's more. There are social problems as well. There are problems with the way people treat you if you're autistic. There's struggles that you have with the way that you respond to other people. So we should perhaps look at those things. We should look at which of those things are the things that would be a struggle, even if there was more understanding, even if the world was really trying to meet our needs. Is it worth treating those? And if so, what's the correct name for those things? Okay, I'll see you in another video.